It all started with what looked like a harmless question, but within hours, it detonated into one of the most explosive WNBA controversies of the season. An ESPN reporter, known for covering the NFL sidelines, casually raised a point about why the WNBA still restricts locker room access for media after games. In his mind, it was a normal journalism discussion. In the internet's mind, it was something completely different, because the reaction was instant, brutal, and unforgiving. Before the reporter could even explain himself, social media had already made its judgment. The phrase "creepy energy" started circulating everywhere, attaching itself to his name like a viral label that couldn't be removed. Fans didn't just disagree with him. They framed the entire question as inappropriate, invasive, and completely out of touch. Within minutes, the debate stopped being about media policy. It turned into something far more emotional. Screenshots spread, clips were edited, narratives were rewritten in real time, and suddenly, one question had transformed into a full-scale internet storm. But what made it worse was the silence from inside the WNBA world. No clarification, no immediate response, just an empty space that the internet filled with outrage, speculation, and anger. And that silence allowed the story to mutate even further. Some called it journalism, others called it entitlement. And in the middle of it all stood a league finally getting massive attention, but now facing a controversy it never asked for. Then, just when it looked like things might cool down, a new reaction surfaced from inside the basketball world, and that's when everything took a turn nobody was prepared for. To understand why this single question exploded into a full-scale controversy, you have to go back years before the internet ever saw this moment. The WNBA has always existed in a strange space inside professional sports, respected, growing, but constantly fighting for visibility, funding, and consistent media attention. For decades, coverage was minimal, highlights were buried, and entire seasons passed without mainstream discussion outside hardcore fans. Reporters who covered the league often worked with limited access, tight schedules, and strict post-game windows. Locker room access, especially after games, was never just about getting quotes. It became a long-standing debate about privacy, professionalism, and respect in women's sports. For some, it symbolized equality with men's leagues. For others, it represented a boundary that should never be crossed in a vulnerable post-game environment. Inside the WNBA itself, players live in a reality most fans never see. A game ends, but the body doesn't immediately recover. There are ice baths, medical checks, emotional breakdowns after losses, and the quiet exhaustion of pushing through elite-level competition. The locker room isn't a media stage. It's a recovery zone. A place where players switch off from performance mode and deal with physical pain, mental fatigue, and emotional pressure. But outside that reality, sports media has evolved into something entirely different. In today's digital world, attention is currency. Viral clips drive engagement, emotional soundbites spread faster than full interviews, and controversy often outperforms analysis. That shift has quietly changed what journalists look for after games. Not just information, but moments that can travel across social media within seconds. That's where the tension begins. Because the reporter at the center of this storm didn't create this debate out of nowhere. He stepped into an already fragile conversation about access, ethics, and evolving media standards in women's sports. For years, critics have argued that limited locker room access puts WNBA coverage at a disadvantage compared to other major leagues. They claim it restricts storytelling, limits authenticity, and reduces emotional transparency after games. But on the other side, players and advocates argue something deeper. They believe the locker room represents one of the few remaining private spaces in professional sports, a place where athletes can exist without cameras, microphones, or immediate public judgment. Especially in women's sports, where scrutiny often feels more personal, that space carries even greater emotional weight. This underlying tension had been building silently for years, never fully resolved, just managed. Until this moment brought it back into the spotlight in the most volatile way possible. And the reason it escalated so fast is because modern audiences are no longer passive observers. They react instantly, emotionally, and publicly. One comment becomes a headline, one opinion becomes a movement, and one perceived boundary violation becomes a moral debate about respect, gender, and power in sports media. So when this ESPN reporter raised the question, he didn't just step into a policy discussion, he stepped directly into a long-running cultural fault line that had never truly been settled. And that fault line was about to crack open completely when the first major reaction hit. The moment the story truly ignited wasn't when the reporter made the comment. It was when the internet decided what that comment meant. Within hours, the original discussion about locker room access transformed into something far more intense, a full-scale accusation of intent, tone, and respect. Clips began circulating with bold captions like "creepy energy exposed" and "reporter crossing the line." None of these edits showed the full context of a statement, but that no longer mattered. The narrative had already taken shape. In the modern sports ecosystem, perception spreads faster than truth, and this was the perfect example of that reality. Then came the first shocking twist, one that completely changed the emotional direction of the controversy. A WNBA-adjacent voice, speaking off-camera during a media discussion, reacted to the situation with visible discomfort. The clip wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. The reaction wasn't just disagreement. It was a strong emotional rejection of the idea itself. The phrasing wasn't polished or diplomatic. It was raw, immediate, and unfiltered. And that rawness made it spread even faster. Suddenly, what had started as a media ethics debate turned into something deeply personal. Fans began interpreting the original question not as a policy suggestion, but as an intrusion into boundaries they felt should never be questioned in the first place. The phrase "locker room is private" began trending alongside the reporter's name, locking the narrative into a moral frame rather than a professional one. Inside the media world, however, a different conversation was unfolding. Some journalists quietly supported the original point, arguing that transparency is essential for modern sports coverage. They claimed that without direct access, storytelling becomes sanitized, overly controlled, and disconnected from the emotional reality of the game. They believed fans were missing the raw truth of competition because too much is filtered through structured press conferences. But that argument only intensified the backlash. Because now the debate wasn't just about access, it was about power. Who gets to decide what is seen? Who controls the environment after a game ends? And more importantly, where does journalism stop and intrusion begin? As both sides hardened their positions, the situation escalated beyond control. Social media personalities, former athletes, and even casual fans began inserting themselves into the argument. Some defended the reporter's intent, saying he was simply raising a structural issue. Others accused him of disguising entitlement as journalism. Then came the second layer of escalation: comparisons. People started pointing toward other sports leagues, especially the NFL and NBA, where locker room access has long been normalized. That comparison immediately backfired in some circles because it raised an uncomfortable contradiction. If it is standard elsewhere, why is it unacceptable here? But that logic clashed directly with the emotional response tied to women's sports, where vulnerability and privacy are often framed differently. And just when the debate seemed like it couldn't become more divided, another twist emerged, this time from within sports media itself. A well-known former athlete turned commentator entered the conversation and reframed the entire issue not as access versus privacy, but as a deeper conflict about respect, timing, and emotional space after competition. That perspective didn't calm things down. It made them worse, because now both sides believed they had moral authority. One side believed they were protecting athletes. The other believed they were protecting journalism. And neither side was willing to back down. And as the arguments intensified, something unexpected began forming in the background. League officials quietly taking notice of how quickly a single media comment had turned into a global controversy, and preparing to respond in a way that could shift everything again. As the controversy spread, what started as a media ethics argument turned into a full-blown identity war inside sports culture. The ESPN reporter was no longer being discussed as a journalist with a question. He was being treated like the symbol of a much bigger frustration that had been building for years. Every new post added fuel. Every reaction made the fire spread faster. And then came the second major twist that completely changed the direction of the entire situation. A former professional athlete and media personality entered the debate with a brutally honest breakdown that didn't defend the reporter, but also didn't fully condemn him. Instead, he exposed something uncomfortable on both sides: the emotional inconsistency of how access is judged depending on context, gender, and league history. He pointed out that female reporters had spent decades fighting for the right to enter male locker rooms in the NFL, NBA, and MLB. At the time, that fight was framed as equality, progress, and breaking barriers. But now, when the conversation shifted toward women's sports, the same concept suddenly triggered a very different emotional response. That contradiction hit like a shockwave, because it forced everyone to confront a question they didn't want to fully answer. Is the issue truly about privacy, or is it about who is entering the space? The moment that argument went viral, the tone of the entire debate shifted from outrage to confusion. People who had been strongly against the reporter suddenly found themselves trying to explain why the same rule shouldn't apply universally. Others who supported him began pushing harder, claiming hypocrisy in how sports media standards are applied depending on the league. But behind all of this, the WNBA itself remained mostly silent, and that silence became its own kind of statement. In the absence of official clarity, every interpretation became valid, and every opinion became louder. Then the escalation reached another level when the conversation moved from policy into emotion. Players' privacy began to be described in increasingly dramatic language online. Fans talked about sanctuary, violations, and boundaries being crossed, while critics argued that professional sports, by nature, are not private environments once the game ends. The locker room became symbolic rather than literal, a representation of respect versus exposure, control versus transparency. At the same time, media figures doubled down. Some insisted that modern sports journalism requires immediacy, raw reactions, unfiltered emotion, and behind-the-scenes access that cannot be recreated later in controlled environments. They argued that without it, sports storytelling loses authenticity and becomes overly sanitized content designed for PR approval rather than truth. This clash of philosophies created a complete breakdown in communication between both sides. Neither was arguing the same definition of access anymore. One side was speaking about safety and dignity. The other was speaking about storytelling and transparency. And both believed they were defending something essential. Then came the moment that pushed everything past the point of recovery. A resurfaced interview clip showed a well-known sports figure casually discussing how the best post-game reactions always come before people have time to think. That clip, originally harmless, was suddenly reinterpreted through the lens of the current controversy. It was now seen as evidence that media systems actively prefer emotional vulnerability over composed responses. That interpretation lit the fuse again, because now the debate wasn't just about locker rooms. It was about whether emotional exhaustion itself was being exploited for content, whether athletes were being protected or positioned. And just as the argument reached its peak intensity, a new wave of reactions from within the WNBA ecosystem began to surface quietly, suggesting that the league itself might not be as unified on this issue as fans believed, and that the next development could completely shift the power dynamic once again. By the time the controversy reached mainstream sports talk shows, it had already stopped being a simple debate about locker room access. It had evolved into something far more volatile, an emotional referendum on how women's sport should be covered in the modern era, and who gets to define respect inside that space. The internet was completely divided. One side saw the reporter's question as basic journalistic inquiry being unfairly demonized. The other side saw it as a clear example of boundaries being tested under the disguise of content access. And in the middle of that split, the WNBA found itself pulled into a conversation it never officially asked to join, but could no longer ignore. Social media reactions became increasingly intense. Some fans posted long threads defending player privacy, describing the locker room as one of the last protected environments in professional sports where athletes can exist without performance pressure. They argued that the moment cameras and reporters are allowed inside, the line between journalism and exploitation becomes dangerously blurred. Others pushed back just as hard, accusing critics of selectively applying standards. They pointed out that male sports have normalized locker room media access for decades and questioned why the same principle suddenly becomes controversial when applied to women's basketball. That argument added fuel to an already burning debate, making it feel less like a policy discussion and more like a cultural standoff. Inside sports media, the fallout was equally chaotic. Some journalists quietly distanced themselves from the original comment, while others doubled down, warning that emotional reactions should not override long-standing reporting structures. A few voices tried to mediate, suggesting that the real issue wasn't access itself, but timing, tone, and how that access is used in the age of viral clips and instant judgment. But the emotional weight of the situation kept growing. Players across the league were suddenly being asked questions that went far beyond basketball. Instead of focusing on games, performance, or season expectations, conversations began drifting toward privacy, discomfort, and media boundaries. Even when players avoided directly addressing the controversy, their silence was interpreted, analyzed, and debated online. That silence became its own narrative. Fans filled in the gaps with assumptions. Commentators speculated about internal league sentiment. And without a unified statement from the WNBA, the situation remained in a constant state of interpretation, where every new post or clip had the potential to reignite the fire. Then came the emotional tipping point. A former athlete's commentary began circulating again, this time stripped of context and presented as a blunt statement about discomfort in locker room environments. The reaction was immediate. Some saw it as validation of the privacy argument. Others saw it as overreach that ignored decades of media access norms in professional sports. The emotional temperature of the entire debate spiked again. At this point, the controversy was no longer just about one reporter or one question. It had become a mirror reflecting deeper tensions in sports culture, between access and privacy, tradition and modern expectations, journalism and ethics. And just as it seemed like both sides had settled into permanent opposition, a new development emerged quietly from behind the scenes, one that suggested the league itself might be preparing to respond in a way nobody had anticipated, and that response threatened to completely change who controlled the narrative moving forward. Just when the debate looked like it had reached its peak and was slowly settling into a predictable split between two loud camps, something unexpected started happening behind the scenes that nobody in the public conversation saw coming. Whispers began circulating from media insiders that the WNBA was quietly reviewing its post-game media protocols, not because of the reporter's question alone, but because the controversy had exposed how unstable the entire conversation around access had become. Nothing official was announced, but the fact that internal discussions were even happening was enough to reignite the entire fire. Because now the stakes were no longer theoretical. If the league adjusted, and as the internet continued arguing, dissecting, and choosing sides, one final question hung in the air with no answer in sight. Was this really a controversy about one reporter's comment, or the first crack in a much bigger system that was never as stable as it looked? At this point, the story is no longer just about one ESPN reporter or one controversial question. It has turned into a full-scale debate about where modern sports journalism is heading and who gets to decide the boundaries of access, privacy, and respect. Some fans believe the backlash was justified, arguing that locker rooms should remain protected spaces where athletes can recover without cameras or pressure. Others believe the reaction went too far, turning a basic media discussion into an unfair character attack and shutting down legitimate questions about transparency in sports coverage. And that's where this conversation really lives now, completely divided, with no simple answer. So the real question becomes this: where do you stand? Should WNBA locker rooms remain fully private, protected spaces after games? Or should media access be expanded in the name of transparency, storytelling, and equality across all professional sports? This debate is far from over. In fact, it feels like it's only just beginning. Because every new reaction, every new statement, and every new clip keeps pushing this controversy further into the spotlight, and the next development could completely change the direction of the entire discussion again. Now it's your turn. Drop your opinion in the comments, because this is one of the most divisive sports debates happening right now, and every voice is shaping how the story evolves next.